Hey there, listener. Welcome to the Deep Share podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rouse, and for the last couple of decades, I've slowly been opening my eyes to a very different world than the one I grew up hearing about. And the more conversations I have with interesting people, the more mystifying this world becomes. So without further ado, let's get deep.
We've got science to celebrate! Demons bliss now! After what, baby? Come on!
There is rebellion in the wind. It will be crushed.
Everything I've said is true. It's real.
Dinosaur fossils? God put those here to test our faith.
A damn lie. I saw them with my own eye.
Did IQs just drop sharply while I was away?
We did illusions, man! None of it is true!
I'm not insane!
This is mass madness, you maniacs! In God's name, you people are the real thing! We are the illusion!
Welcome back to the Deep Share. Tonight, I have Gordon White with me. Very exciting to talk to you finally, Gordon. How you doing, man?
Doing well. How are you?
All right, pretty good. So I've been following your work for quite a while, and I've listened to a number of your guest appearances, and I've always been really fascinated by what you have to say. But for those who aren't familiar, out of my listeners and viewers, why don't you give a little bit of background of what you do and how you got into it?
Sure. So I'm Gordon. I'm an author and podcaster and magician. So I host Rune Soup, which has started off as a blog and is also a podcast and kind of like private members area where we do different kind of quarterly trainings and all kinds of fun stuff to do with magic and that kind of thing. And yeah, I write books. I'm originally from Australia. I've lived all over the world. I've lived in New Zealand and the UK and done work in New York, that kind of stuff. And now I live on a little permaculture farm in southern Tasmania, because that's the other thing I do. It's the sort of one of those like spoiler things. The difference between something like magic and permaculture is really one of definition, right? It's like how to best live in a living universe. So that's my story. I write books on stuff like magic and I blog and podcast about that and similar things. Also parapolitics, because again, if you're dealing with power, you're dealing with power, and that's me in a nutshell.
Cool. All right, great. So let's see, what should we get into first? I have so many interesting questions to ask you about like the magical side of it. And I've heard some of your astrological forecasts in the past, and those have always been very eye-opening. And I was just wondering if you could kind of explain how you come to these astrological forecasts. It's through tarot, right?
No, so that's an interesting one, right? Like, every 6 months we do a forecast episode, so we do a half-yearly one, and I get my friend Austin Kopic, who's actually a really, really good astrologer, on the show. What I bring to it, it started off just me, and it was a bit of a joke, but it was kind of true, at least at the time, that I didn't really know that much about astrology, nor was I inclined to learn. So it was really just fun to ask Austin sort of like really basic questions when we first started doing, which we've now been doing for years, this kind of tradition. But in the sort of intervening time, I not only reconsidered astrology, but I reconsidered what astrology kind of like, this sounds arrogant, like I've sold it, but like what astrology actually is. And that, as far as I can tell, is and I actually gave a presentation at an astrological conference a couple of months ago about this, that astrology is a kind of like culture-specific way of realizing that the universe is cyclical, that it runs according to cycles. And that's a universal observation. So you get that all over the planet, and you even had that in European culture up until the kind of disastrous decision with the Enlightenment that actually, as the song says, things can only get better. And we made life into this linear, ever-improving model. And this kind of faulty belief gives us the kind of scientism and wacky experimental injections and all the rest of it that we have today, right? And everything else that we observe in the cosmos is cyclical, but we're stuck with this premise that the universe is linear, right? And there's a real tension to it. So that sort of started me on this long running quest and fascination with various different cycle models or cycle frameworks all around the world. They're mostly people know them from like economics. People might be familiar with things like Kondratiev waves and so on. But there's this one guy, Martin Armstrong, who has been a trader and a market maker in metals and all kinds of stuff from like the 80s on. And he actually went to prison because he wouldn't give Goldman Sachs and the CIA the kind of AI that he built, his kind of like forecasting model, which is all based on cycles, right? And so I've become very fascinated by his work. And he's quite dismissive of astrology because in the 70s, he actually looked at it to see if it correlated with his model. And the astrology in the 1970s was terrible. Astrology in the last 20 years has really grown up. There was a thing called Project Hindsight where all these kind of like classic, I don't want to say ancient, but say Hellenistic texts that hadn't been translated or even looked at for 1,500 years were translated and reincorporated back into astrology. So it kind of grew up, right? And so all of a sudden, we look at these different cycle models all over the world. And I include various forms of astrology in that. And I'm interested in where they correlate and where they overlap. And so, for instance, depending on when you're watching this, the space weather, if you will, from November to the end of February, it's just shit. Like I could tell you where the eclipses are and so on, but it's ghastly. And that's absolutely, if you just look at the dumpster fire that November has been and what December's shaping up to be, you're like, yeah, that tracks, right? Now, why that's interesting to me, that's there in the astrology, is that that's there in Martin Armstrong's forecast as well. So when you start to get these different cycle models kind of like lining up with certain dates or periods, then I get particularly interested because all of them are going to be imperfect. They're going to be imperfect attempts to provide a framework for something that we know to be true, which is that the universe is cyclical. So there's kind of like an uplift in accuracy, I find, at least for me, if I look at more than one model, if I look at Kondratiev models and Martin Armstrong's models in astrology. And when I say astrology, I mean astrologies, right? So if you look at Vedic astrology and kind of like Hellenistic or modern, they're all, they don't kind of interlock. They don't need to. They're kind of like descriptions of a true thing. So that's kind of what I bring to it. And they're fun because the world, when the world is going through what it's going through now, it's actually quite predictive. You think it's unpredictable, but it's not. It's and it kind of allows you to. It invites you to look at the preconceptions that you are bringing, your hopes and fears and things to the future, because if you like, seeing things clearly is a powerful medicine. And so at the moment, like, things just kind of continue to get worse, and it's how you frame that and where you look for, the medicine and the uplift in it. So it's sort of it turns out prophecy during strange times is fun.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say it is very predictable. I mean, especially, I guess, if you perhaps have the eyes to see or want to see.
Exactly.
You start to see the patterns. Often I tend to be able to avoid the very COVID-y specific topics in my research and stuff, because really we're just seeing a mirror image of things that have kind of played out in the past. Am I right? And
it's the, how I describe it is, you actually, because why I'm fascinated with Martin Armstrong is that in the 1980s, he spent about $100 million in 80s dollars he was the largest private owner of ancient coins in the world, buying Akkadian tablets, old banking books. Like, he basically hoovered up. He did what I would have always wanted to do. If someone asked me to prove astrology and gave me an unlimited budget, I would get all this data from all over the world and basically crunch the numbers, looking for the cycles, looking for the patterns. And he did that. He did that with his own money to build his own, platform, right? And what I say is, you don't actually need this $100 million AI that you go to prison to defend from the CIA to kind of know that where we are politically and almost philosophically is highly predictable. They only know, like, the worldview of people in power, the worldview of a Fauci or something, only knows how to do one thing, right? So they're never going to, like, admit they're wrong. They're never going to be like, well, that didn't work or any of that stuff. They only know how to do one thing, which is make money for their corporate paylords in a materialist universe. So it actually is quite predictive, right?
Yeah.
So you don't even need it. And as you say, you can avoid getting into the weeds of the minutiae of whether these particular injections glow blue or any of that, and just look at it and go, well, this is, I know what politicians do. I know what bought and paid for politicians do, and I know what bought and paid for bureaucrats do, and we're seeing it.
Oh, constantly. Yeah. It's kind of like they're doing their own magic, right? I mean, they're possibly into dark arts. I'm curious how far down the rabbit hole of like government secret societies and those evil doings do you go? Like, do you think it's more of like just misdirection and it's all corporate espionage and stuff like that, or do you think it's a very dark roots at the top of the pyramid?
Like, it's a bit of both, and the thing that people, before they do that, and my first book, Starships, which is called A Prehistory of the Spirits, is sort of about this in almost like an Ancient Aliens context, where what you first need to do is ask yourself how you think the universe works, right? Do spirits, and I mean, you can use the word demons, whatever, but like, does the spirit world impact the human world? Are they implicated in what it is that we do? And are we even aware of it, right? So you don't actually need to have like a satanic pedophile cult to posit that there are very dark forces co-implicated in how power operates in the world, and that's always been the case, right? And that's kind of where you can look at some of those pictures of, you know, world leaders who look quite possessed, and maybe like a low resolution take is that, oh, he's obviously part of the cult, right? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily. And in fact, it's that kind of classic, the devil's cleverest wile is to convince man he doesn't exist. Right. I think a lot of these people are the playthings of beings like that, without a kind of conscious awareness. And we used to have a framework for that. We used to understand what that meant in the West. Everyone else does. Everyone else wasn't stupid enough to think that this doesn't happen. And so anywhere else you go in the planet, there are magical, spiritual, whatever you want, methods of kind of like cleansing and inquiry and so on to solve for this reality, which is sometimes we get bugs, right? And I think that, so you start there. As for whether there's like a super elite cabal of whatever, maybe. I certainly know that there are some people at a senior level who do kind of have that sort of public school boy understanding of Luciferianism. But I think by and large, most of the time we're kind of like finger puppets on the end of this kind of being, right? And that's in many respects scarier. It's easier to think it's sort of like the Clintons and Epstein in a pedophile cult somewhere. It's what do you do if this being like is older than the earth? What do you do?
Yeah, it's like some eldritch ancient one or something like that. Well, I've been often saying lately that like we blame a lot of politicians or the elite cabal for like the symbolism you see, but I can't like conjure a good example right off the top of my head, but you see the same coincidences and patterns in natural occurrences and natural things too. So it makes you wonder, it's like, well, whoa. If we're suggesting that this system is in charge or ruling over us, doesn't seem to just be a bunch of politicians. It almost seems like they're more just going through the motions with incentives and this and that. Because think about it, if we're moving towards like a robotic technocratic future, it's probably people that don't want too many masters over the machine. They're just many cogs in the machine. That's about it, right?
Yeah, and that's a good kind of point. Like if you're talking about the sort of synchromistic analysis of stuff that I think a lot of people in this sort of world mistake elite rituals for, well, what they consider to be elite rituals, I think are better understood in almost every case as like synchromistic. Like it's in a Jungian sense that there's certain archetypes that are kind of like closer to the surface of the unconscious at this point, because you kind of credit these people with this all-powerful like hyper organized, like impossible hyper organized. And then they've arranged this at this music festival in Texas to go on at the exact same time as this, and all these moving parts. And like, if you actually stop and go, well, how would you project manage that personally if you were in charge? And you go, well, hey, this is not quite right, especially particularly when you dive into that research yourself, those syncs start to happen around you. It's like, well, they're not doing that, are they? They're not doing the ones that are around you. So like, maybe, and this comes back to that, what I was saying before, maybe it's in the universe. Maybe it's not in the pedophiles, right? Like, maybe it's actually, maybe it's a function of the universe. And that's like both scarier, but also optimistic. And I agree. Like, it's most of the people in the fucking pyramid, right? They
just think they're getting rich.
Yeah, they're hyper atheist technocrat. They think all of this stuff is superstitious nonsense, right? The very, very top, that is probably different. But I think most of the time, 80% of what people see and maybe mistake as elite ritual is just what happens where, and I don't mean to dismiss it, it's worth researching, but it's like, you live in a living universe and it does things like this because it's speaking to you and it's speaking to it. And this is what that looks like. So the magic of the elite is in most cases, not all, accidental, because you are dealing with symbolism and archetypes and moving it around. But you're also being moved around by it.
Yeah, I've been kind of saying this line where it seems like the strings are being pulled from outside of the theater.
Yeah,
kind of feeling. And then, I don't know how deep you go into maybe the philosophies behind like Gnosticism and things like that, where I love the idea of the demiurge, how it almost seems like the actionable side of consciousness or God or source or something, whereas the original being that creates the demiurge, I can't remember, I think it's a female name, it's kind of just pure existence with no experience attached. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to frame this properly, but what do you think of this? It seems to me that there's a realm that we all kind of seek, and in that realm, and no matter how we get there, it's like this stillness, this pure being, there's no experience attached. It's just pure observation. And I'm wondering, while we have like a lot of spiritual teachers out there kind of talking about our power as if we're kind of like Marvel superheroes living many, many lives and on different planets and from the Orion and this and that, it kind of feels like a distraction, because it feels more like we wouldn't have an inkling of what an experience on that side of things would be like, because wouldn't time and space only exist here? And if everything's happening all at once, is that even an experience to really undergo or report back on? Does that make any sense?
Sort of. So
Okay.
I quite like Gnosticism. I'm not a Gnostic. I have this post that's a few years old now, like maybe 7 or 8 years old now. Gnosticism is the map, animism is the territory. And you can kind of understand. So the cosmos is alive. And my next book, which is coming out, I think next month, is about that. With Gnosticism, what you have is kind of like, so I say the most Gnostic movie in the world is Dude, Where's My Car? Because it's this weird, creepy feeling that things aren't right. And like our origin is probably weirder than you can possibly imagine. And so with Gnosticism, it's kind of like what Graham Hancock calls a species with amnesia. When it comes to Gnosticism, it's a species with a hangover. It's like, I know what happened last night, as in the act of creation was weird. There's like lizard beings, there's dwarf strippers and it's that kind of, we get flashes that the whole cosmos is unpredictable and irrational in the sense of like beyond rationality, doesn't submit to a rational or ordered analysis, right? So sure. Gnosticism is one of them. I do think there are kind of like cleaner ways of knowing how we can know as humans, right? So like next to Gnosticism, you have something like hermeticism, and in the Poimandres, when mankind is created, And we are essentially created to complete creation. So along with essentially the divine being, we co-create the cosmos. And there's sort of two ways we do that. We're given nous, which is translated as mind, but it's better understood as like a faculty of perception, and also the world of form. So like the spirit world. So the way remote viewing works is through nous, right? Like it's this way of, we call it mind, but it's better perceiving. But we're also given logos. And logos is like the son of the creator being. So it's sort of almost like Jesus being installed in your mind. But that means logos is there for us to touch and hear. So what you're actually reading when you read the Poimandres is that God experiences the universe through you, through your sense perception, right? So that's one of the ways it happens. And that's how we participate and co-create. So there's sort of a way to validate almost like a linear or human experience of space-time within the context, like how we do that within the context of a sort of all now kind of universe, which I think is more correct. I tend to use like something like an Aboriginal dreaming model rather than, ones you'd find in European thought. But the same idea is there. It's like, how do you, as a being currently in time, at least partially, how do you think about the universe and time? And everyone has a framework for it, right? Because that's how we are. The shamans have a framework for it. The hermeticists had a framework for it. And I like a sort of co-creative one. You can kind of get there with the story of the demiurge as in like a fashioner. I think Gnosticism is a mutation of a kind of like Greco-Egyptian Jewish philosophy that mutated because of, in large part, dissatisfaction with the Roman Empire and whatever going on at the time, like Israel's under occupation. It really does look like the world is run, and as it does again today, by like a cruel idiot God, right? And that we're sort of trapped here because it didn't, all the promises of the priests, because I think Gnosticism is mostly Jewish in origin, but like Jews from Egypt, so hence the mix. But you look and the temple's gone again, all this stuff the priests promised, like none of it happened. So the God of the Old Testament is this idiot. You kind of see projected the politics of the day into the cosmology of the time as a way to understand evil and misfortune. And that's why I say it's a map, because it's actually quite a good map. What it does is reorient you to like, well, what is important then? And is that can a system of power be saved? Like, it's a classic anarchist argument. If you become emperor, can you fix it? Or is the existence of the emperor and empire fundamentally flawed? In which case, where are my priorities? What are my spiritual priorities? And Gnosticism can invite you to think that way.
Yeah, I was just talking to a friend about how when the mainstream media falls, will be the media. And then I got a really bad taste in my mouth after saying it. It's like, because that's usually the thing, you live long enough to see yourself become the enemy or something like that. I was curious, you were doing this thing a couple weeks back, I think, about can't stop the signal. You were talking about that, like the ever enduring human spirit kind of, right? And I'm curious about how, if the universe runs in cycles, are we just playing out a play and it's better to just be aware of the play? If it's, is the revolution even real?
I use a farming metaphor for this because the short answer is yes, but the better answer is like, the key to farming is to know where you are in the cycle. So I'll do it, you're in the Northern Hemisphere, so I'll do this for you, right? Like if you plant tomatoes in October, nothing's going to happen. Same for me if I plant them in like May or June, right? It's heading into winter. You have to know where you are in the cycle. There are things to do on a farm in late fall, early winter. Planting tomatoes isn't one of them. And so the key to meaning and thriving in this life, in like this particular incarnation, is to know where you are in the cycle and to recognize what is in fact going on. And one of the reasons people are completely losing their mind at the moment is that they won't look at that. They think enough compliance and enough boosters and they can go back to brunch. it never happens. we're in like I mean, you might get brunch again, sure, but there's no return to rationality such as it was prior to this, because we're at a transition point. It's a slow motion / fast motion decline of the West and rise of Eurasia, and it doesn't mean we all live like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, but that's what's happening. And you have to know, and you know, and I opened Chaos Protocols with a Terence McKenna quote, like, the challenge or the problem isn't to find the answer, it's to face the answer.
Yeah.
And the reality is, you know where you are in the cycle. And that doesn't mean, again, because the end of the West is like a cosmic thing. It doesn't mean you personally are going to like be kicked out or whatever. But it does mean that growth and optimism, maybe some of the things you wanted to do with your life will look differently now. In the same way, like, oh, I was going to plant tomatoes, but like it's late autumn. I guess I'm not going to do that. I guess I'm going to do something else, right? And so we're not necessarily just, I mean, this is weird. Maybe we are just players in that kind of Shakespearean sense. But what I can tell you for sure is that you have to know where you are in the cycle. You have to like, and it's not, you can't just like cross your fingers and wish that it's just going to go back to normal.
But they teach us to do exactly that, right? Just don't worry, we got you. So with that being said, Gordon, what part of the cycle are we really going through right now?
Yeah,
Like,
this is
we got this dark
the
winter coming, right? I mean,
you're talking short term.
I'm talking short term right now, because I think a lot of people out there are pretty scared, and I've actually said it before to someone on the podcast, saying like, I think we're all kind of looking out the window at our neighbors. All right, nobody else is packing up yet. Nobody else is running for the hills yet. And it's that mentality that's kind of going to bite you in the ass eventually. So it's like, yeah, on the long term, we can trust the universe and all those good things. On the short term, it does feel like spirituality and sovereignty can kind of clash at times. And this is getting a little freaky here and there, you know, and especially not to put too much into this one thing, but I mean, I know where you are, it's maybe not where you are specifically. How is where your home? Is it nice and no masks and that's still going on?
You know, those hills you just referenced that people head to, I'm in there, right? I was joking about this today. I live in Australia's southernmost municipality. So I live on Tasmania, which is an island south of the mainland. And I live in its southernmost municipality in like this hilly valley called the Huon Valley. So when people say head for the hills, they mean they're coming to my house.
Oh man, sweet.
So I have no more hills left. I have no more hills left to head to. Like, it's just like, I'm closer to Antarctica than I am to the top of Australia, right? It's where I am as a country is a nightmare, right? Yeah. It's an absolute nightmare. Where I am as a state so far, if you can get to Tasmania, life just carried on like normal down here. There were no masks. There was a couple of weeks of restrictions last year. Life just more or less carried on as normal. But you can't get here because of this nightmare country, lunatic people closing borders and the rest of it, right? So I was for like waiting for neighbors to leave. I'm like, we got nowhere else to. We're in the hills already.
You're good. Yeah. Especially with the permaculture too. That's great.
Exactly. Yeah. And when I moved down here, people were like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, like I knew the when of this, but I didn't know the what. I don't think anyone predicted such a stupid what that would bring down the West. But here we all are. But I'm like, you know what? It's such a great place to live. You know, if the apocalypse does happen, I'm in a pretty good spot. But if it doesn't, this is a lovely like valley that grows cider apples and wine and all this kind of stuff. You know, this is actually a pretty good place to live anyway. Yeah. But as for like what is going to happen, or more like what people
short term.
Yeah, I think this is going to be how I described it to the premium members on the website, where we are at the moment. Is it's kind of like we're 60% of the way through this narrative, but we're only 35% of the way through the tyranny. And so the good and the bad news on that is we're sort of, everyone is feeling the exhaustion of this narrative. And so that's where at the 60% mark, where it just doesn't work quite as well anymore. However, we're only 35% of the way through the tyranny. And when the narrative starts to fail, they dial up the tyranny. So the good and the bad news is there's they've got to fit more tyranny in less time. The good news is that's kind of like popping a zit is what will bring it all down. It does bring down a lot with it. And there are people who will just never come back to reality from it. So this is what I mean by you need to know where you are in the cycle. There's no like, oh, everyone woke up and realized that this highly weaponized narrative is being used to push forward like a technocratic agenda and whatever, and we don't want to do that, so we'll all just carry on with like that. That doesn't happen. Right? There are people who like in 20 or 30 years time will die still wearing masks, right? It's the damage has been done. And so that's what I mean by you got to know where you are. And where we are, generally speaking, is the West is dismantling itself for frankly no good reason. And that's the thing that means that, like, and again, it's fine, but this is the rise of Eurasia that we're witnessing, and Beijing will be the financial capital of the world in Armstrong's model by the year 2032. So the decade is not good. We do this virus narrative, and then we do very serious shortages, and then probably extremely high risk of international war. Like this is where we are in the cycle. Now, again, that's what the world's going to do. You need to know that it isn't what you're going to do. So you need to know what the world's going to do, so that you don't, I don't know, decide to plan some sort of, well, I was going to open a travel business in China. Like, it's okay, don't do that, right?
Yeah.
Do something different. So there is still opportunities for like happiness and fulfillment, or you wouldn't have come to Earth at this time. But you will miss them if you also miss what the world is going to do. And I think a lot of people freak out about that because it's quite American. It's less European, but it's quite American to over focus on the positive, or assume that things will be overcome, that there will be solutions, that things get better. Some things don't. Some things collapse. Some people die, right? And that's something that needs to be seen clearly in order to navigate. And it's not just people on, dare I say, our side, because we tend to fall into, our version of falling into fear isn't fear of a virus or the postman, or staying in your house for 15 months, ordering everything from Amazon and sanitizing it at your front door. Like, that's mentally ill, right? But so is being afraid of everything and assuming that there's like a depopulation agenda coming specifically for you and what have you. Like, fear is the mind killer, right? And that's where we are.
Right. Yeah. How much of what they do is actually just fear tactic and not actually, like, there's so many incidents where people have taken them to court over certain mandate laws, or whatever, not even laws, just mandates, and it gets thrown out immediately, or cops are, threatening rioters and then just walk right away because it's kind of all a charade in some sense of the word. It's very bizarre. And I'm wondering, like, okay, fine. I get it. We're in this cycle. Is there, we were also hearing a lot of like, oh, but this is the time where those that get it are going to kind of come together and wake up, and they're kind of going to break away from the technocratic whatever. If that's what's going to happen, then I don't see myself as a part of it. So, I mean, are we kind of going to be breaking into these very different groups, these vastly like two different sets of societies living quite, is it going to be Mad Max?
It's not going to, well, in some parts of the world, yes, but so that is already happening. And it's something that Zach Bush said last year that I liked. I think it was the best thing anyone said last year, and it was on Aubrey Marcus's podcast. And he said that the people who need to find each other to be the thing that comes next are in the process of finding each other.
Oh, that is beautiful.
and that's absolutely what's happening. When I look at the different and new friends I have down here who are kind of awake, but the same thing, it's why, again, it's like you need to see it and realize it's there rather than build it. It's that kind of idea, oh, hang on, well, I'm in this kind of global network of people who think alike, some of whom are here, some are not. And there's a sort of permaculture term that I've been using for it, which is like to be a guild in place and to be like a spore or like mycelium in the world. Mm-hmm. So to be kind of hyperdimensionally connected with shared minds all over the planet, and also to be a guild in place in the sense of fitting in a way that helps. So we've got people, I mean, we do our own food and whatever, but we've got people who do that kind of stuff. And we're all kind of, we've built this community that's, it's really fun to be in, regardless of what's going on in the world. Like I would want to live that way anyway.
Right.
And so it is happening. And I do think that is one way of looking at what's going on now. It is some kind of, everything is a cosmic initiation, but this one's just more obvious.
Mm-hmm. I like that. What do you think the mechanism is, if there is one, like perhaps a universal one, that does shake people awake from the illusions that they tell themselves? I mean, I often wonder if it has to be an ordeal of some kind, because I mean, it comes in a lot of different forms, but you know how you can't just wake somebody up even with a blatant fact. Sometimes it has to be something maybe very personal, or I don't know. What do you think of that? What is it? Is there a mechanism there that decides whether a person is kind of have the capacity to do something like that, or what do you think?
Probably. So my father is retired now, but was a psychiatrist, and he has this very psychiatrist dad joke, which is, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? One, but the light bulb has to want to change. And that is what's going on at the moment. So you're probably familiar with Matthias Desmet's work, the Belgian psychologist talking about mass formation. When I first heard that the other month, I'm like, yeah, this is exactly what it is. So some people don't, this is what I mean. Some people don't wake up. And it's because we're using a framework of asleep and awake. But what's going on there is that their entire lives have been in this state of anxiety and fear. And this mind virus, this sort of like word virus, here's an actual virus that's going to, is the cause of all your anxiety. And it gives you little rituals to alleviate that anxiety, like wearing a cloth face covering and what have you. If you try to break someone out of that, they just dig deeper into it, because you are deemed to be like the anxiety coming back, right? So right. It's actually, it further solidifies how what their coping mechanism is. And so I don't know, this is what I mean. There are still some people who think Russiagate happened. Like I don't know, I don't think some of them come back. I just, and so you just need to, and it sucks, but those of us who are not in that situation need to find our own way of being in a world where you have to interact with people who live in a completely different reality. And that requires like an inner strength, right? Because their anxiety coping mechanism shouldn't upset you as much as it does. I mean, it does to start with, but you have to find a way to not let it upset you, because this is someone who is damaged, and is basically, and the way I have compassion for them is that they are the victims of state assault. They are the victims of state violence. There's a 20-month psychological terrorization campaign. They're not to blame for it. They've been broken by violence. That's literally what happened. They have been assaulted by their own state at the behest of their billionaire paymasters, right? So that's my way to, because I have family members who are in that situation.
Yeah,
so that's my way of how, at least for now, I navigate. And it means it's easy to lie and just to drop into the lies, the false narrative, when you have to do things like go to a store. You could kind of drop into a lie without it burning through your soul of like, you people are all idiots. What are you doing? You can kind of just go, okay, well, they're doing their coping mechanism thing, and me yelling at them actually makes it worse, right? So I'm really into this post-activism idea of what if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? Because it is. And it turns out yelling at scared people makes them more scared. And if you're trying to make them less scared, don't yell at them.
You brought us right in other words, right into the next thing, which is my curiosity about something called revelation of method. And it's something that I've been familiar with for a lot of years, and I'm hearing it more and more as time goes on. And the more I look into it, the more it does feel like exactly what you're saying, where it's like it doesn't necessarily even have to be some cryptocracy plot for us to just be accidentally spreading more fear. Or maybe it's just a byproduct they look forward to or something, that they know that we're going to be doing this and it's going to afford them better opportunities perhaps or something.
Yeah, I'm not sure about revelation of the method. I know it's supposed to be some Masonic thing, but I've never been able to find that to be true. What I do think happens when you're dealing with actual psych, there's two important kind of caveats to that. The first is they don't care what you think, right? At all. So if you read A Game of Nations by Miles Copeland, I just did a video on it. It's one of those kind of like important globalist books. Or if you read Tragedy and Hope, of course, the classic, right? They just tell you what they're going to do. They tell you who's doing it and what they're going to do, because you don't matter. Like you can't stop them, and they don't care what you think, right? So there's that side of it where they're just like openly saying this is how we run countries and whatever. Mm-hmm. And then there's the more psychopath side, which is they hate you. They hate you more because you let them get away with it. There's that kind of like violent, abusive husband kind of thing going on there, where they hate you for letting you do it, for letting them do this to you. And that's absolutely going on. We kind of prove why we should be depopulated down to 500 million people, because we let them continue to do this. And so there's a revelation of the method in there where they're kind of like just sickening, like we sicken them because we let them do it, right? And so they'll tell you, and it's almost part of that cruelty. It's almost part of the whole like, I can't believe you're letting, like they're laughing at us at the same time.
It's getting more obvious, right? Yeah. With the dancing syringes on the Colbert Report and all these crazy things. It's unbelievable.
So I don't like revelation of the method. When I first looked at it, it was supposed to be that like there's kind of like a Masonic code or whatever, that you're not allowed to do something without revealing it. I don't think it's that. I think it's meaner. I think on the one side they don't care what you think, and on the other side they hate you because we let them get away with it. So it's that level of cruelty. That seems to be my guess about it now. I do think they speak to each other. I learned this from Chris Knowles. They speak to each other with signaling and certain words and numbers that they'll use in important articles. But I think they just hate us.
Fair enough. Yeah, the part of revelation of the method they were talking about was the karmic part of it, where people suggest that they have to tell us because of karma. But I mean, first of all, I think the universe is smarter than that. And second of all, I don't know if you know much about this gateway process. Have you heard of that?
Don't think so.
Okay, so it was a document that came out supposedly, I don't know, recently from the CIA, supposedly talking about remote viewing and astral travel and all that stuff. Within that document, they talk about their perspective on karma being that in this process of going to these places and whatever, you can obliterate karma right away and it doesn't matter whatsoever. And so the two don't really match up with one another right there, if that document's true, you know. But I was curious what your take on karma is. I mean, that seems like a weird statement to make, that karma can just be obliterated, you know.
And especially the people who do this, they don't believe in that stuff. They believe they think they live in an amoral universe of nothing but like molecules and chemicals, and they're going to live forever as some half robot on Mars married to an 11-year-old. Because they live in a universe where there's no consequences to any of that stuff. They live in a consequence-free universe already, private jets and so on, right? So yeah, as for karma, I don't think anyone at the Clinton level and above is overly concerned with it. As for what it is, an easy way of understanding it is just kind of like the inertia of the universe, right? So and that passes through lifetimes as well, which means if you generate a bunch of violence, then there is violence in the universe. It goes somewhere. So karma is just, it's easy understood as inertia. You do more good stuff and there's more good, right? So, and again, I come back to like wave models or cycle models, where if you take a bowl of water and you shake it, and there are all these like waves going everywhere. That's karma, right? That's kind of why the whole idea of being free from karma is essentially to do nothing, to be to be either immobile or invisible, so that you don't generate anything and nothing gets hit or bounced off you. But it's kind of like waves in a pool, if you will.
Yeah, I like that. I'm seeing a lot of that recently with frequency and all that talk that's going on. Let's switch gears a little bit, because I know that you know a lot about the ancient world, and you have a lot of information surrounding Atlantis and things like that. And I have never specifically been interested all that much in Atlantis, other than a fleeting glance, until recently. In the past few months, I've kind of gotten really deeply involved with myths coming from the north that tell a really different interpretation of Atlantis. So I was just curious what your take on Atlantis was, and I just want to see what your framework of it is, so I can fit it into mine.
So, like, my first book is in many respects about Atlantis. Atlantis is, again, it's like a culture-specific memory of the sensation that we used to be better at this as humans, right? We used to be better at this. We can be sort of proud of what we do, but there's this sense that we are declined. We are declined from elsewhere, and that's more or less universal. And so Atlantis, as we have it, is obviously via Plato, via Solon, if he existed, via Solon's trip to Egypt, if that happened, right? And I think it probably did. I think it probably did happen. I actually think Plato spent time in Egypt, to be honest. But anyway, I'm one of those people who thinks, because the ancient Greeks never met someone else's idea they didn't like. I mean, if you look at what Greek thought is, it's everyone else's thought put in a toga. And so what we look at with Atlantis is the, let's just say, Eastern Mediterranean awareness that prior to the high civilizations of the Mediterranean, way back, there were other civilizations that were as good or better. Now, everyone has that one way or the other. So the Sumerians have that, but also like non-city-based cultures have that. So you can find a similar idea in the Amazon. You can find the idea in parts of Aboriginal Australia, except they're these beings that we descend from aren't always fully human. They're dreamtime beings. So like part spirits and so on. And so I think it's a couple of things. I think in general, the universality of the Atlantis belief is sort of like an awareness of, or like a memory of our true home. Like before we come to Earth, there's this, we used to be better at this. We used to like live without violence and what have you. And I think a big part of that is a memory of our true home on a spiritual level. I also think it's a memory of the 150,000 years that we lived as hunter-gatherers and didn't fight and were a foot taller and healthy and had kind of like living in communion and full ceremony with the cosmos. Like, it's basically my utopia. Now, that being said, when we're talking about human timelines, there are plainly complex physical cultures or civilizations that predate the ones that we sort of arbitrarily decide at 3500 BC begin with Sumer and Egypt, right? And so in that sense, because again, we've got a couple 100,000 years to play with, even just going by mainstream models. And so there are some places in the world where I think there are, and the main one being essentially the Yucatan and kind of like the Gulf of Mexico area, that what are now like Maya lands, basically from the western tip of Cuba into the Yucatan, I think is one place where there was like literally, I think that's the actual Atlantis that the Egyptians are referring to, right? And most of that's underwater off the western tip of Cuba. And again, you have the same problem that Graham Hancock encounters, which is when you're dealing with stone, and limestone is datable, but how do you measure the age of a building that no longer exists because it's been fully replaced? I start Starships with the story of the knife. It's this Hindu story of a knife where a guy's like using his knife and someone asks how old it is. And he's like, oh, it's very, very old. The handle's been replaced a couple of times and the blade's been replaced a couple of times, but it's still the same knife. And that's what happens with like sacred sites, where the stuff that's there now It's still the same sacred site, but it's been there for so long that it's been replaced. So I think there's a few places in the world where that's in play. But as for like if you're wondering where like actual Atlantis is as described in the Timaeus, the best guess, the best match to the data is essentially a pre-Olmec, or probably the Olmecs, who knows, but like a pre-Olmec or something like that civilization in the Gulf of Mexico and the Yucatan is the guess. But that's kind of, so there's a lot going on with it, right? Which is everyone has this awareness that we used to be better and we live in a kind of declined state. And we used to believe that, again, up until the Enlightenment. That was common knowledge amongst like Europeans up until the Enlightenment, which was we had declined. And even the idea of the fall or the expulsion from the garden is this idea that we used to live better than we do now. And now we're kind of like worse at being on Earth. So that's a universal idea that you kind of need to explore, because I think a lot of Atlantologists miss the universality of that and kind of run off down like the wrong kind of rabbit holes, because you kind of need to square with that before you go digging or scuba diving, right?
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because I've heard many different interpretations of it, but I think the universal one is the most comfortable one to sit with, especially if we're talking about strings being pulled outside of the theater and stuff like that. I mean, yeah. Well, look, there are cities and residencies and healing centers and whatever in the spirit world that are accessible now. Like in my shamanic lineage, there are healing centers in the spirit world that I can take people to or call healers and shamans from, that I've been to, that are in the spirit world, right? So when you're talking to cultures who are certainly more sophisticated than me, but like sophisticated enough to basically live multidimensionally here in the physical, the awake world and the spiritual, the way they phrase like, oh yeah, there's a city over there. I know this from like doing work with on Non Madol in Micronesia, right? I've been there a bunch of times. That Kanimweso, the city that it is built next to and as a mirror of, is a spirit city. Like it is there in the water as a spirit city. And so this is the trouble, we're bringing this kind of like European Enlightenment idea to it. And so we have all these assumptions about how reality works, which are wrong, and they will get in the way of us finding what's actually there, I think. Okay, that's good. I like that. Yeah. There's a lot of, it's like there's shadows in front of us that we can't see behind. We're never going to get the full picture exactly, right? Well,
I don't think there's any such thing as a full picture, but we won't get anything if we don't step out of that colonized European thought of materialism. Even people who are trying to get out of it. Hence, Starships, my book, is called that because it's kind of a critique of ancient aliens. It is an explicit critique of something like ancient aliens, because it's the people who go looking for aliens in nuclear powered rocket ships who taught people how to build the pyramids or whatever are only allowing for material things to be true, right? So they're already taking the truth claims of the Enlightenment, of the materialists, of Fauci with them on their quest in an attempt to evade it. In their attempt to kind of like re-enchant the universe, they're bringing their disenchantment with them. But if you actually stop and go, well, hang on, when other cultures talk about star beings, they have more sophistication than we do because they're aware that these things exist in a non-physical way, and we don't allow for the non-physical to exist. So that's kind of the challenge with all of these fields, is you have to do philosophy first before you can go digging or diving.
Yeah, even the Anunnaki at some points in the story aren't even physical at some times.
Exactly.
So it's very hard to nail that. And you look at the idea that they needed us to do the work for them because it was too hard. And it's like, well, okay, but that's a big symbol right there that you see in a lot of religions about this force not being able to do it on its own and needing this third party to do it for them.
That's co-creation. We were just talking about that in hermetics, right? Like that's right. When you say that the gods need us for something, we are being invited into a co-creative idea.
Yeah, I like that. I never thought of that story in the co-creative sense, because it's kind of brought to us in such a warring,
it's
scary,
grim. It's like
negative
we have to
thing.
do the slavery stuff. We're made out of
Right.
mud, and we have to do the slavery. Like, it's grim, but if you actually look at what's going on there, there's a kind of messed up co-creation story.
So on that same thread, reptilians. I want to talk about reptilians. I want your take on reptilians, because that's a really hard one to deal with, because there's so many different people who have claimed to experience and have visitations from these creatures. And could it be just an archetype, and we are using our memory to just fit the new experience to something? Or what's your take on reptilians?
So, well, again, people bundle up a lot of stuff all in the one thing, right? So there are, again, in my shamanic tradition, Sachamama, the great serpent, is one of the beings that we heal with, right? So there are, and ayahuasca, I've been in ceremony in the jungle and all that kind of stuff with ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a serpent as well as all this other stuff. So there are serpent beings, and they are generally the good guys, right? And that's, which you would know, that's how it ended up kind of inverted and twisted in the Bible. But at an early level, these are good guys in the sense of older and wiser than us. And it's one of the funny things about indigenous cosmologies that don't have something like geology, right? They get the order of beings correct in terms of who's the little brother and who's the big brother. And that's why the plants are the principal teachers of mankind, because they know more. They've been here longer than animals, right? And so if you go into the Amazon, the plants are the main teachers, and we listen to them. And so there are spirit beings that are reptilian, if you will. Now, if you're referring to, and this is a really good one, you know what a screen memory is, right?
Say that again?
You know what a screen memory is?
No, I've never heard that term.
Okay, so it's sort of like a ufology hypnosis idea, where like these beings can potentially generate a screen memory so that you might see under hypnosis. I saw an owl, and then under hypnosis it's like, but it wasn't an owl, it was something else standing outside my window, right? So this is kind of like screen, yeah. So there's this kind of like screen memory idea. When it comes to like David Icke looking at the Queen and seeing a lizard, what he's actually, I give him credit on this, what's happening there is kind of like a screen memory experience, where what he is seeing is this kind of cruel power structure on planet Earth, right? So that cruelty can be visualized and expressed, or can be experienced as like, I saw them having lizard eyes. And I'm like, well, the people you're seeing who have lizard eyes are, these really dangerous and powerful people. So I think there's a lot of that going on there, rather than there actually being shape-shifting lizards running the planet. I think it's better to say that what he's seeing is a true thing, which is the injustice of this like cruel and bizarre governance system that we're all subject to. Absolutely, right? And it is so cruel and bizarre and weird, and you can react to it in such a like visceral way that it can present as lizard, right? It can actually present as it. And I think a lot of that goes on. I think a lot of that goes on. Yeah.
There's like, there's always so much like, scary demonization of reptiles and snakes and serpents and things like that. And I know that we're kind of saying that a lot of them are kind of like the good guys, Enki, things like that. And then, you go back into all these symbols of the people of the serpent. It does seem to be more of a knowledge giving, wisdom giving kind of thing. I just lost it. I was going to bring it right back to something you had said earlier. Now it's gone.
Like the knowledge giving thing is so important, because it is. And when you come up on ayahuasca, the patterns that happen look very like you're very often swallowed by the snake on the way through, right? So it is the being that provides medicine and stands at that threshold. So that kind of look, that sort of patterning that happens with entheogens or spirit travel looks like serpent skin. And so if you're wondering why, and if you watch an old David Icke presentation where he's looking at the sort of reptilian and dragon motifs in heraldry in Europe and so on, well, yeah, like, of course, they associate themselves with these kind of like these ancient beings of knowledge, and that's the trouble. It's sort of there's a reality to it. There's a reality to these beings that isn't necessarily, well, isn't at all that kind of David Icke idea that the Rothschilds are secretly lizards and we've been invaded by lizards who are running the planet. It's not quite that. But I understand why people can experience a power structure that way, because it's horrible. We live in this, like, it's insane the way this planet is governed.
So I remembered what I was going to say. Do you think maybe the serpent archetype has been demonized because in the most ancient cultures, didn't it represent that cyclical nature of the universe?
I've
heard that before.
It wouldn't. It's not just one thing.
Fair enough. Yeah.
It's not demonized for one thing, and it isn't. It's only demonized in one place. That's the other side of it, right?
Yeah,
so
okay, true.
It's just that it's this one place that then happened to build a culture that went and did this whole sort of thing. And even that. So if you actually look at the role of the serpent in the text, it's not, God curses the serpent to, like, crawl on its belly for what it did. But that's like a just so story of how you end up with serpents. It's that weird thing about the Old Testament where it's so old and those texts are basically ported directly in from Sumer anyway. So you look at it and go, is it really a bad guy, or is it a being playing its role? And so even though we've demonized the serpent, because we have, like, subsequent millennia have demonized the serpent, but have we actually got that wrong? Have we actually got that wrong in the Old Testament? And I'm not saying it's like a good guy necessarily, but Gnosticism was trying to work that out as well. It's like, well, who's the bad guy in this play? Is it the angry man who condemns mankind because some chick ate an apple, or is it like
it's creepy serpent?
Yeah, and it's sort of this open question, but it's more to the point, like, do you think it was demonized? The serpent, my farm, I live in Australia, this place is riddled with deadly snakes. And we're heading into snake season now. So we have black tiger snakes, a famous large one living underneath our guest house, but they're everywhere, right? And you just have to, they're just here, right? And I love them, but I don't pat them. And you check your boots for them when you get up in the morning, because I love them, but I do not wish to be bitten by them. And so the serpent is just archetypally so potent that it's really difficult to land on like a one thing. Because I know it's the old Jordan Peterson comment that it's possible that our fear of serpents is kind of like built into humans because even monkeys are scared of them or whatever, right? Maybe, but it's such a potent symbol. It's such a potent being that what it stands for is potent and powerful as well. So it's kind of like, I don't think you find cultures anywhere that consider them huggable. Right. No one has them as like pets, right? That's not true. People keep them in there, like, and in fact, in New Guinea is one good example of that, but they don't keep them as pets in the same way you keep like a poodle. So we come into relation with serpents differently because they are so complex and ancient and wise. So it's when we try to work out, like, the serpent used to be good and now we think it's bad. I'm like, I don't actually think we ever thought it was good. I think we thought it was serpent. I think we thought it was just
doing
almost too much to handle. Yeah,
right.
Almost too much to handle. Yeah.
So we briefly touched on the Genesis story real quick. Just I wanted to get your take on this, relating it to Sumer. Would that really be God, or was that just the big scary brother? Was that just an Enlil Enki sort of situation with the serpent and this Yahweh thing? Because what things that are contentious for me in Genesis, one, why does God have to ask where Adam is hiding? And the other part, and I'm not sure if this is, I don't think this is in the King James Bible. It may be from an earlier translation, that the wording is that, like, I was hiding because I was afraid, because I was naked. But before that happens, we see he was clothed before Yahweh yells, "Where are you?" And what I'm trying to gather from a couple different sources is, was this saying because of the knowledge of the tree that he did eat, he was aware of good and evil. So he wasn't afraid because he was naked, and he wasn't hiding because he was naked, but it was because Yahweh was looking for him, and he knew who Yahweh was.
But so I really like Genesis, and I really like the Book of the Watchers and all that kind of stuff. I really like. Now, what we miss is these things. So there's like two accounts of creation for a start, just in the one that's in the Bible, before we get to all the apocrypha that aren't in the Bible that also describe it, right? And the story of the Watchers in Enoch is a good example of that. So these stories were not supposed to, the narrative as we understand it today didn't exist back then, where you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it all kind of has to fit together and work. That's not what creation stories were for. A creation story was designed to, in the telling around a fire, bring you into resonance with some kind of like truth about reality. So if you try to like read it forward, it's like, well, hang on what day did he do what? And you say it's created this way, then not. And it doesn't make any sense. And now he's naked, but then he wasn't, but then he was wearing something.
So I'm reading too much into the metaphor.
Well, no, like, because there's a really good point there. But what's happened is that it's multiple different versions of a creation story that are kind of like put together, which is why it doesn't make a lot of sense. But it also, when you know that, you're freed up to kind of like, well, look at what's actually going on here. When it's like, when we were walking in the garden with God, and God was visible, it means there was a time where God was evident to us in creation, right? Like, so it was when we walk with God in the garden, it's that we see the divine in all things. So that's quite shamanic, right? And for God to not know where Adam is, it's because he's fallen out of that state. So he's no longer aware of the divinity in all things. He's fallen. It's like God can't see him because he's kind of like dropped out of sacred vision. So there's this sort of the idea of walking with God in the garden can be this amazing thing to tell an agrarian civilization or society. Like when you're out there with your olives and so on, you can witness God in it. So there's all this kind of like wonderful stuff in it. But if you try to like string it together, you go, oh, well, this is a hot mess. And unfortunately, I think people dismiss it, because then you're missing out on a tremendous, like, a lot of medicine is in that. And also once you realize it's a palimpsest of text and they're all kind of stacked up, and a whole bunch of the motifs have come from Sumer, and maybe the angels themselves came from Babylonian captivity. But the story of the Watchers is a similar example of like an earlier version of creation, and more like an explanation for how evil is in the world that doesn't blame humans. Because the blaming of humans for evil in the world was kind of like a rabbinical trick to shore up rabbinical power. If evil just existed because like angels sort of fell, then it's very difficult to build a system of law codes around a population. If you say that evil happened because of things humans did, then you get to kind of like describe their actions and what they can and can't do. But the earlier idea of how evil came into the world is the Watcher's story. It's not the eating of the apple, right? So like all these texts kind of open up to kind of magical and philosophical analysis when people think that like studying the history of biblical text or whatever takes the magic out of them. It gives it back, because
absolutely.
Because I found I went to not for very long, but I went to like an Anglican school, and we had like religious education in primary school, and I found it deathly boring. It was only when I was an adult and kind of looked this up for myself, I'm like, God, they could have taught that in such a better way, and and everyone would have been interested rather than just sitting there, right? And I think that works with these are kind of like our stories. And when you break them into, or if you return them back into little motifs, it's easier to see them as this overlap between you and like Sumer. And from Sumer, like all of like proper ancient history opens up. So I used to joke to my grandmother, because she was Catholic, that she was, you know, off to mass to worship a star god, because she was like, she's basically off to worship El. She didn't much appreciate that, but you know, I don't make the rules. That's just the history of it. But I like that. I think that's cool.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. And this has been a really fun conversation, man. I feel like we'll have to do this again on like a very particular topic or something. And we jumped all over the place because I just wanted to get to know you and see what you had to say about these things. And man, you definitely gave me some stuff to think about, because I was kind of going down a very cryptic conspiracy trail and I do often with the religious stuff. And, you know, I got to remember that a lot of this is fractal and a lot of this is, the truth is different on almost every level of it. You know,
that's exactly right. Yeah. That's good serpent insight, by the way, that it is different on every level. There you go.
Absolutely. Well, Gordon, please tell my audience where they can find your work.
Absolutely. You can find everything at runesoup.com, and that's where the show is. You can search for it on YouTube or Odyssey or Rumble or any of that kind of stuff. And that's where you'll find us. All
right. And you said you have a new book coming out possibly next month.
Yes. So the pre-orders are any day now. And then it's whenever it's ready. It's called Animistic. And I'm really happy with it. I think it's my best book.
Oh, I'm very excited because animism is like my favorite thing in the world. And we didn't cover it much. So that means you'll have to come back at some point.
All right, there you go.
All right. Take care, Gordon. And everybody have a great night.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Deep Share Podcast. If you want to hear more, then hit that subscribe button. Follow me on all the social places. And remember, think for yourself, but don't always believe what you think. Till next time.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, that's hysteria. Enough, I get the point.
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone.
What do we know? What do we know? If I know what we know, then I can tell you what we know, and if someone else knows, okay?